This could get a little messy. Today we're diving into the deep and wonderful world of aperture. And we're going to be discussing whether the next prime lens that you buy should be an f1.4 lens over an f1.8, or whether you should go against the bokeh gods, save yourself some cash, and buy yourself a reasonably priced f1.8. Now for the lens that I'm going to be using for all of the examples in this video, the Sony 35mm f1.4 G Master. And for this video, it's only the 35mm f1.4. Why this video isn't just about that single lens? Well, one, because I don't have the f1.8 version anymore. And the second reason is I can go out and get many different lenses and try them all and put them all in one video. But there's way too many lenses out there for me to do a comparison of them all and tell you which ones you should buy and which ones you shouldn't buy. Too many lenses would create too many variables, and that would dilute the whole situation of this video. Each different lens gives you a different effect, a different vibe, and all the mechanics inside these lenses all function in a different way at a different speed. And on top of all of that, even the camera body that you put the lens onto can actually become a large factor. As I say, it could get a little messy. Now, first up, let's start with the very basics. Some of us may be new here and we may be thinking, well, what the hell is aperture? It's pretty much the opening of the iris within a lens. The bigger the opening, the smaller the f number, such as f1.4 and f1.8. The smaller the pupil gets, or the smaller the opening, the larger the f number is, like f16 or f22. And the opening of the iris within a lens does a number of things to your image. Sometimes there's some pros, sometimes there's some cons, and away from all of that, there's a lot more things which affect your image. Affecting your image practically, physically, and definitely affecting your bank balance. So first up, and I hate saying this word so much, but if you want the most cinematic look, if you want the most creamy, delicious, buttery smooth, all the lovely food related adjectives you could possibly think of for bokeh, you will instantly want to go out there and buy the lens with the widest aperture, make it the widest aperture, and just start shooting. Having the widest aperture will give you the most amount of depth of field, meaning that everything in the background and everything in your foreground, pretty much everything in your image bar the subject, will be out of focus. However, something to bear in mind is that if you're shooting at f1.4 or even sometimes f1.8, depending on what lens you're using, depending on what focal length you're using, and depending on how far away your subject is from the front element, perhaps not even all of your subject will actually be in focus. And this can make situations when you're dealing with manual focus fairly tricky, especially for video. Not saying that it can't be done, but whoever's going to be pulling focus for you will be getting a little bit sweaty. The whole depth of field, aperture, and bokeh situation is purely down to artistic taste. Because if you were taking photos of a large group of people and they were all different distances away from the lens, you could still use a prime lens, but you definitely don't want to be shooting f1.4 or f1.8. You'll find yourself around about f4, f5.6, maybe a little bit more. And when it comes to landscape photography, you can still use a prime lens. Of course you can. You can use any lens that you want, but you're going to be at f8, f11, maybe even f16. So if you're a landscape photographer, maybe paying the extra bit of money for the f1.4 isn't quite worth it. Again, it comes down to what you actually need and the individual lens that you're going to be buying itself. Whilst we're talking about the iris and the characteristics it gives you, we should probably talk about the iris itself. Normally, the more expensive a lens is, the more aperture blades it has on the iris. For instance, the 35mm f1.4 has 11 aperture blades, whereas the 1.8 only has 9. Now, what does that mean for your image? Pretty much the more aperture blades that you have, then the creamier the background will be. Again, going into the creamier adjective. Again, it all comes down to personal preference, and that isn't to say that a lens with a lower amount, I can't get this out, a lower amount of aperture blades looks bad. Now, one of the biggest benefits of having a lens with a lower aperture, even lower than f1.8, is the amount of light that comes into the lens. If you shoot anything indoors or in just low light situations, you want to have the aperture as wide as possible to be able to keep that shutter speed nice and fast. That reduces the amount of motion blur possible in your image, and also it can keep your ISO just a fraction lower than what it normally would be. If you're shooting astrophotography, for instance, you may actually benefit from having a lens which is f1.4 over f1.8, because again, it's allowing you to capture more light in that instance. Now, sharpness is another variable to consider. Most lenses, generally speaking, are their optically sharpest when you've stopped down by 1 to 2 stops on the aperture. However, that statement isn't 100% accurate across the whole board, so please bear that in mind. Generally speaking, a lens with an aperture of f1.4 will hit its optically sharpest a little bit sooner than a lens which is an f1.8. And the unique characteristics of each lens doesn't just stop there. For instance, this 35mm, even though it's so expensive, does have a fair amount of vignetting when you're at f1.4, and it doesn't really clear up until you get around about f2. This lens also has a large amount of focus breathing, which may not be a big issue if you're using it for purely photography purposes, but for video, it could add a complication into your shooting. Whereas its little brother, the f1.8, the vignetting at f1.8 is nowhere near as bad as what this is at f1.4. And on top of all of that, the f1.4 lenses, and especially the f1.2 lenses, are a considerable amount more money over the f1.8 lenses. So perhaps if you don't need all of the light and all of the depth of field, but the performance that the 1.8 gives you, it may actually benefit you to save the money and buy just the 1.8 version. Overall, lenses are all different, and that's why there's so many of them on the market, and that's why we're always swapping and changing them. Each lens has its own set of characteristics. Some may be good for you, some may be bad for you, but as photographers and videographers, we have to decide which ones of those are bad to us and which ones are good to us, and prioritize what we prefer. The main reason I chose to upgrade from the f1.8 to the f1.4 is because I'm a wedding photographer. I spend a lot of time indoors photographing weddings, and sometimes natural light isn't really on my side. However, on the flip side of that, I still have the Sony 85 1.8, and I did consider buying the 85 1.4. However, when I tried it, the focusing wasn't that great. And for me personally, no matter how much light a lens gives me, sometimes it's just not worth it if the lens struggles to focus and get the photo sharp in the first place. So that's it for me today. Thank you very much for joining me. If you want to see more content like this, hit the subscribe button. And if you do, I'll see you right there in the next one. Laters.